Shadows of Empire. The call to arms in the early years of World War II, the vast landscapes of Africa became silent recruiting grounds for European empires, desperate for manpower. From the sun-baked savannas of Senegal to the mist-covered highlands of Kenya, young men who had never seen Europe suddenly found themselves called to defend it. The war, born from the ambitions of distant leaders, stretched its shadow across the colonies, reaching villages where the names Hitler and Mussolini meant nothing. What began as a political conflict in Europe soon became a summons for millions of colonial subjects who had no voice in the decisions that led to it. Recruitment campaigns swept through towns and rural settlements like wildfires. French and British officers, accompanied by local chiefs loyal to the empire, carried papers stamped with royal seals and promises written in languages few could read. Some men enlisted willingly, tempted by the promise of steady pay, food, and uniforms that carried an air of dignity. Others were taken by force, rounded up at night, dragged from their huts, and told they were serving for the good of civilization. In truth, they were being absorbed into a machine of war far beyond their understanding or control. The young recruits gathered at colonial training posts under blistering heat. They were given numbers, stripped of their native clothes, and dressed in ill-fitting uniforms stitched in factories thousands of miles away. Their languages were replaced by orders barked in French or English. Their identities, tribal, familial, and spiritual, were pushed aside to mold them into soldiers of an empire that still considered them inferior. Discipline was brutal and punishment swift. Yet, beneath the harsh drills and alien rituals, a quiet resilience began to grow. They learned to march in rhythm, to handle rifles, to obey commands shouted in unfamiliar tongues. What they could not yet understand was that these drills were preparing them for a war that would demand not only obedience, but unimaginable courage. For many, the call to arms carried mixed emotions: fear, pride, confusion, and even hope. Some saw it as an escape from poverty, a path to manhood, or a rare opportunity to see the world beyond their horizon. Others felt the heavy weight of betrayal, forced to fight for nations that had enslaved their ancestors. Mothers wept as sons were taken away, unsure if they would ever return. Entire communities were emptied of their youth, leaving behind women, children, and elders to tend the fields and pray for mercy. When the time came to depart, these men stood at colonial ports staring at the vastness of the Atlantic. Many had never seen the ocean before. The ships that awaited them were overcrowded, creaking with supplies and human souls. They left behind the red dust of their homeland for the gray fog of Europe, where the air smelled of coal, smoke, and fear. As they sailed toward the unknown, their minds swirled with questions: who was Hitler? What was freedom? Would they ever come home? No one could answer them. The empire simply demanded, and they obeyed on arrival. They were dispersed into regiments with names that still echo faintly through history: the Tirailleurs, Senegal, the Kings, African Rifles, the Royal West African Frontier Force. Each unit carried its own traditions, songs, and unspoken codes of brotherhood. In the barracks, the African soldiers quickly learned that bravery alone would not earn them respect. Their European officers often treated them as expendable, useful for the dirtiest and deadliest tasks. Still, among themselves, they forged a sense of unity that transcended tribal and linguistic barriers. Shared suffering became their common language. News from home was scarce. Letters, when they arrived, were censored or delayed for months. Yet, even in isolation, they carried their cultures with them. Quiet prayers whispered before battle, charms hidden under uniforms, and stories told at night around makeshift fires. In these small rituals, they kept their humanity alive amid the dehumanizing machinery of war. The call to arms had transformed them. They had entered the army as subjects of an empire. They would soon become witnesses to its contradictions. They were expected to fight for liberty while being denied it themselves. In the Opera's eyes, they were soldiers when needed, and subordinates when not. But on the battlefields that awaited them where death did not discriminate by color or creed, they would prove that courage knew no race, long before the world recognized their contribution. Their journey from the heart of Africa to the front lines of Europe had already reshaped the meaning of loyalty and sacrifice. Fire and steel. African soldiers in Europe. The moment African soldiers set foot on European soil, the world around them shifted into a realm of cold, chaos, and disbelief. The Europe they had imagined, the land of power and civilization spoken of by colonial officers, was now a continent in ruins. Cities were reduced to rubble, villages burned, and the smell of gunpowder lingered in the frozen air. These men who had grown up beneath the African sun suddenly found themselves fighting through blizzards, wrapped in thin uniforms that could not protect them from the merciless European winter. The cold was not only physical, it was also the chill of being strangers in a war that saw them as both allies and outsiders. Their introduction to modern warfare was brutal. Many had trained with outdated rifles under palm trees, but now they faced German tanks, machine guns, and artillery that tore the earth apart. The thunder of explosions echoed through valleys, shaking the ground beneath their boots. The African regiments were thrown into the fiercest fronts, often used as shock troops to break enemy lines before the European divisions advanced. Orders came without hesitation: advance, attack, hold, and they obeyed, knowing each step forward might be their last. In Italy, they scaled treacherous mountains under relentless bombardment, the snow stained red beneath their feet as they dragged artillery through mud and ice. The terrain was foreign and deadly, but their endurance became legendary. French commanders noted their ability to move silently through the night, to fight without food or rest, to hold positions when others would retreat. Yet, these same commanders often spoke of them as brave savages, their praise poisoned by condescension. Heroism was acknowledged, but humanity was denied. When the campaign shifted to France, African soldiers became essential to the liberation of southern cities at Toulon, Marseille, and the Rhine Valley. They stormed German defenses with ferocity and discipline. Eyewitnesses described scenes of incredible courage, men charging through gunfire to rescue wounded comrades, others refusing to surrender even as their ammunition ran out. But behind every victory lay staggering losses. For every medal pinned to a chest, hundreds of nameless bodies were buried in unmarked graves. The official reports rarely mentioned their contributions. In photographs and newsreels, their faces were cropped out, their skin color deemed inconvenient for propaganda celebrating European victory. Despite the cold reception, camaraderie began to form on the front lines. Shed danger blurred racial divisions, if only for moments. White soldiers who had once doubted their African counterparts now watched them hold their ground under impossible fire. A few bonds were forged in blood-silent nods of respect in the middle of chaos. Still, prejudice was never far away. When food ran short, the African troops were the last to be served. When shelter was scarce, they slept outside. When victory came, their names were left off the list of heroes. Yet, even in these cruel circumstances, something extraordinary. The African soldiers carried themselves with quiet pride, writing letters home filled with fragments of hope and longing. "The snow burns like fire," one wrote, "but we fight on because the world must change." They believed, perhaps naively, that their sacrifice would earn them a place in the history of freedom. That belief kept them alive when the world around them offered nothing but death. In 1944, when Paris was finally liberated, African soldiers played a vital role in the victory. They were among the first to break through German lines in the south, clearing the way for the Allied advance. But when the moment came for celebration, they were told to step aside. High-ranking officials ordered that only white soldiers march in the Liberation Parade. The cameras rolled, capturing images of triumph, images that erased the faces of those who had bled for that very triumph. For many African veterans, that moment became a symbol of the empire's hypocrisy. They had fought for freedom that did not include them. Still, their pride endured. Around campfires and in war-torn fields, they shared stories of bravery and laughter amid despair. They sang songs in Wolof, Swahili, Yoruba, and countless other tongues, weaving fragments of home into the alien night. These songs were not of glory, but of remembrance of brothers lost, of battles survived, of dignity preserved in a world determined to deny it. Through fire and steel, they carved their place in history, even if history tried to forget them. The war was far from over, but in the crucible of Europe's destruction, these men proved something undeniable. Courage knows no color, and loyalty has no borders. Their footprints in the snow of foreign lands were the first steps toward reclaiming their own sense of worth, a quiet revolution born from blood and endurance between two worlds. The battle for dignity when the guns finally fell silent and Europe began to rebuild. The African soldiers who had survived the inferno found themselves stranded between two worlds. In Europe, they were invisible. In Africa, they were changed, men returning to lands that no longer felt like home. They had stared into the eyes of death, crossed oceans, fought in snow and fire, and watched the supposed masters of the world tremble under the weight of war. But the reward was not honoret, was silence, neglect, and humiliation. As demobilization began, promises dissolved like smoke. European officers shook hands with each other, celebrated, and received medals, promotions, and pensions. The African troops, meanwhile, were herded into camps to await transport back to their colonies. Some waited for weeks, others for months, fed on scraps and uncertainty. When payments finally came, they were often less than half of what white soldiers received. Many were told that their native status entitled them to less because they came from poorer lands. The very empires that had demanded their loyalty now dismissed their humanity with bureaucratic indifference. When they boarded the ships home, there was no triumphal music, no flags waving, no parades. The men who had bled for the Allied cause returned to villages that had aged in their absence. Families gathered at the docks, unsure whether to rejoice or weep. Some soldiers came back, maimed, missing limbs or eyesight. Others carried invisible wounds, memories of comrades torn apart by explosions, nightmares that refused to fade. For many, sleep itself became a battlefield. The war was supposed to end in 1945, but for these men, it never truly did. At home, their reintegration was far from easy. Some communities viewed them with AOD, others with suspicion. They had seen the world beyond colonial borders and no longer fit neatly into the old order. Chiefs and elders, often tied to colonial administrations, feared their influence. The returning soldiers spoke of equality, of rights, of dignity concepts that challenged the very structure of empire. They told stories of how white men bled and begged for mercy, how the myth of European invincibility had shattered in the mud of battlefields. These stories spread quietly through towns and villages, igniting something new in the hearts of those who listened. The bitterness of betrayal began to transform into something powerful, awareness. They had been told they were fighting for freedom, yet they returned to nations still chained by colonial rule. The contradiction was too sharp to ignore. If we could fight the Germans, they asked, why can't we fight for ourselves? That question, whispered in the shadows, became the foundation of modern African nationalism. It was no longer just a political idea, it was personal. They had seen liberty with their own eyes. Even if it wasn't theirs to keep. And now they wanted to claim it. Many of these veterans became leaders, organizers, and revolutionaries in the years that followed. They understood discipline, unity, and sacrifice better than anyone. The skills learned on European battlefields became weapons in a new kind of war, one fought with words, protests, and movements instead of rifles. In Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal, former soldiers began to gather and speak openly about independence. They had learned to follow orders, but now they learned to give them to lead, to question, to resist. The same courage that had carried them through the fires of war now fueled their struggle for liberation. Still, the emotional toll was immense. The veterans carried a double burden, the trauma of battle and the bitterness of being forgotten. In some colonies, those who demanded equal treatment were imprisoned or silenced. In others, they were beaten down by poverty. Their heroism reduced to fading memories. Yet, even in their quiet despair, a sense of dignity persisted. They had faced the worst of humanity and survived. No government could take that from them. Between the world of empire and the dawn of independence, these men existed in a painful, in-between limbo of identity and purpose. They were both victors and victims, heroes and outcasts. But their very existence challenged the moral foundation of colonialism. By proving their bravery and intelligence in war, they had destroyed the myth that Africans were inferior. Even if the world refused to acknowledge it, history had already shifted. The battle for dignity did not end when the war did. It began and you fought not with guns, but with memory, pride, and persistence. Every veteran who told his story, every son who listened, every mother who remembered a name carved into a crude wooden crossage became a soldier in the silent revolution that would soon shake the colonial world to its core. They had once fought for the freedom of others. Now, they would begin to fight for their own. The forgotten aftermath when the guns fell silent in 1945 Europe rejoiced beneath a sky of fireworks and flags. Nations sang of freedom, parades filled the streets, and leaders spoke of a new world built on justice. But far from the cheering crowds, in the heat of West Africa, silence and bitterness hung in the air. For thousands of African veterans, the war did not end. With victory, it lingered, like a wound that refused to heal. In the outskirts of Dakar, Senegal, rows of makeshift tents filled with weary men told a different story. These were the Tyroleurs, Senegalese soldiers who had fought and bled for France. They had marched through Italy and France, liberated villages, and faced death in Europe's frozen trenches. They returned home, expecting the rewards they had been promised: equal pay, pensions, and the respect of a grateful nation. But what they received instead was delay, deception, and disdain. Months passed in the demobilization camps. The heat was suffocating, food was scarce, and morale sank into despair. Many soldiers had not seen their families for years. They were told that France had no funds to pay their back wages. Rumors spread that the white soldiers had already been paid in full. Anger built slowly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. In a camp of Thiroy, that storm would finally break. On the morning of December 1st, 1944, hundreds of veterans gathered peacefully to demand what was theirs. They were unarmed. Their only weapons were their voices and their dignity. But to the colonial authorities, African soldiers asking for justice was an act of rebellion. French troops surrounded the camp with machine guns. What happened next would stain France's honor for generations. The order was given fire. Gunfire tore through the air. Men who had fought bravely under the French flag fell where they stood. Dozens were killed. Some say hundreds. The survivors were arrested, beaten, and silenced. Within days, the official reports twisted the story, branding the veterans as mutineers, criminals, traitors. The massacre of Thiroy became a secret buried beneath layers of lies and censorship. France, a nation that had preached liberty, equality, and fraternity, could not face the truth of what it had done to its own soldiers of color. Yet, memory has a way of surviving even the deepest silence. Families whispered the story in the dark, passing it from parent to child. Songs were written in secret, names remembered in prayer. Across Africa, word of the massacres spread like wildfire. It became a symbol, a grim reminder of how empire rewarded loyalty with bullets. The blood spilled at Thiroy would water the seeds of African independence movements for decades to come. In the years that followed, the world moved on. Europe rebuilt. Monuments were raised to fallen heroes, but not to those who came from the colonies. The names of African soldiers faded from textbooks. Their medals forgotten in dusty boxers, their graves left unmarked. Their sacrifices were erased, not by time, but by design. Historians looked away. Politicians stayed silent, and the public never asked the uncomfortable questions. But silence does not last forever. Decades later, new generations began to uncover the buried past. French filmmakers, African historians, and descendants of the fallen dug through archives, searching for truth among the ashes of empire. They found records that had been hidden, testimonies that had been suppressed. The story of Thiroy began to reemerge not as a footnote, but as a wound demanding recognition. For the families of those who died, acknowledgement came slowly, painfully. Some veterans were posthumously honored. Others received apologies that came too late to heal the damage. But even in their sorrow, there was pride of quiet, defiant pride. The men of Thiroy had stood up not only for money, but for dignity. They had fought, once again, for a freedom that was denied them. Today, as historians re-examine the global narrative of World War II, the story of Thiroy stands as a haunting reminder. Victory means nothing if it is built on forgotten bones. The African soldiers who helped defeat Hitler were not just victims of racism. They were pioneers of resistance. Their courage, their endurance, and their final stand against injustice have outlived the empire that betrayed them. And so, the world must ask itself, what is the worth of a victory that forgets the men who made it possible? Echoes of honor, remembering the unseen hero's time as a strange way of healing wounds and yet preserving scars. Decades after the last shots of World War II echoed across Europe, the silence that once shrouded the African soldiers who fought in it is finally beginning to break. Their names, once erased from the chronicles of empire, are being spoken again in classrooms, museums, and memorials. Across France, Britain, and the African continent. The ghosts of forgotten warriors are returning to their rightful place in history. No longer are they invisible, their stories, once buried beneath the pride of nations, have begun to rise like morning light after a long night of denial. In towns across Senegal, Mali, and Ghana, young people gather to listen to veterans, descendants speak. Old photographs creased, faded, yet powerful are displayed in exhibitions. Letters written from European battlefields are read aloud, their ink trembling with emotion. Each word bridges the gap between past and present, reminding the world that freedom was not the gift of one race or nation, but the blood-earned right of all humanity. In France, plaques now bear the names of African regiments that helped liberate Marseille, Toulon, and Paris. The ceremonies are solemn, yet redemptive. Wreaths are laid, hymns sung, and tricolor flags lowered in respect to men who once marched beneath them in silence. In Britain, historians have begun to uncover archives that document the role of African troops in Burma and North Africa. Long-forgotten pages that rewrite the narrative of Allied unity. Even Hollywood and European filmmakers are finally turning their cameras toward these men whose courage shaped the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. But beyond the rituals of remembrance lies something deeper, a moral reckoning. The legacy of these African soldiers is not simply a matter of military valor. It is a mirror held up to humanity itself. They fought for ideals they were denied. Liberty, equality, brotherhood. They fought to free people who still saw them as inferior. In that contradiction lies their greatest heroism. To fight without hatred, to serve without reward, to endure humiliation with dignity. That is a form of strength that transcends the battlefield. Their legacy does not rest only in the stone of monuments, but in the pulse of generations that followed. Many of the independence movements that swept across Africa in the 1950s and 1960s were born from the experiences of these veterans. The discipline they learned in the army, the exposure to global politics, and the painful realization of their exploitation shaped a new consciousness. They returned home no longer as subjects of empire, but as men who had seen the fragility of those who claimed to rule them. They brought back a vision, a dream of nations standing free, equal, and sovereign. And yet, remembrance is not about glorifying war. It is about reclaiming truth. The story of these African soldiers reminds us that history is not a single voice, but a chorus. For Toulon, only one voice was heard, the voice of empire, of victory told through the lens of power. But now, other voices rise. They speak of courage without recognition, of wounds carried in silence, of families who waited in vain. These voices do not seek revenge. They seek acknowledgement. Justice, not pity. Respect, not apology. In villages across Africa, memorials built of local stone and bronze now stand where the veterans once gathered. School children place flowers beneath them, not fully understanding the magnitude of the sacrifice, but feeling its weight all the same. Elders tell stories by firelight, their voices trembling with pride. The names that history forgot are spoken aloud again, and in that act of remembrance, something sacred happens. The past breathes. To remember is to restore balance. It is to say, we see you now. The echoes of these soldiers' footsteps still resound in the soil of two continents. They are the bridge between Africa and Europe, between war and peace, between oppression and awakening. Every medal tarnished by neglect, every photograph faded by time, every letter crumbling to dust, all are testaments to a truth that can no longer be silenced. When we honor them, we do not rewrite history. We correct it. We give voice to the unseen, face to the forgotten, and dignity to the denied. Their legacy is not just a reminder of the past, it is a warning for the future. Because forgetting is the first step toward repeating. And if you listen closely, beneath the ceremonies and the silence, you can almost hear their whispers carried on the wind. We were there, we fought, we bled. Do not forget us. Their courage endures. Their sacrifice speaks. Their honor echoes through time.